And for more on this, I want to bring in Oubai Shahbandar. He is a TRT political and defense analyst. And Oubai, you've obviously been watching what has been unfolding. The White House pretty clear that Trump and Putin would not have a formal meeting, but they came together on the sidelines of this conference to develop this joint statement. How significant is this?
Well, if you look at this statement, it's certainly extensive in nature, and there's a lot to unpack. So let's start from the very top. At the forefront, both Presidents Putin and Trump expressed a joint commitment to defeat Daesh, and they expressed a level of satisfaction that the enhanced cooperation and deconfliction, as this joint communique refers it, by the U.S. military and the Russian military over the Syrian battlefield has been working in the fight against Daesh. So that's one. Number two, they were focusing on the Geneva peace process. So this joint communique, what was so interesting about it was that it specifically pointed to the current Syrian president, Bashar al-Assad, the Assad regime, and it held the Assad regime accountable to the Geneva peace process and the political transition that's agreed upon by the United Nations, that's ensconced in this process. This calls for constitutional reform. This calls for eventual free and fair elections that will be monitored by international monitors, and that would be an extraordinary step towards moving Syria away from the violence and towards some sort of political settlement. And lastly, there was also a focus in this joint communique on establishing a ceasefire in parts of Syria and southern Syria, and establishing de-escalation, continuing the de-escalation process. Not a full ceasefire, but a de-escalation of the fighting in northern Syria and parts of northeastern Syria, and allowing unrestricted humanitarian access to all parts of Syria. Now, as this statement, this joint communique, was being released by the Americans and by the Russians, if you look at, we also have to look at what's happening on the ground in Syria at the same time. There are still children that are starving to death in eastern Ghouta, which is a suburb of Damascus. Just imagine, just barely 10 miles away from the Republican palace, from the presidential palace in Damascus, you have children starving to death. We're seeing some horrific images that are being smuggled out by Syrian activists in Syria. So clearly, there's still a long ways to go in Syria. There's clearly a problem with humanitarian aid and humanitarian access getting to the people that need it, getting to the children, to the civilians that are still trapped and besieged by the Assad regime's forces. And there are, of course, still major questions on whether or not Bashar al-Assad would hold free and fair elections and reform the country and the constitution. So there's still a lot of unanswered questions, but this statement by President Putin and by President Trump is hopefully will lay the foundation to move forward.
And what about Assad? You just brought him up. Is this sort of America giving its permission to Moscow to go ahead with its plans to end the conflict in Syria, yet keeping Assad in power?
Well, if you look at what's not in this joint statement that was released, you don't read the word political transition. Just a few years ago, Washington, D.C., the buzzword was that Bashar al-Assad could not remain in power, that he had to go, there had to be a political transition process. You don't see that in this document. You do see many referrals to the Geneva process, but the Geneva process is fairly broad. So given that the Russians have fully backed Bashar al-Assad, and it still seems pretty clear to us that they will continue to back him, many of the Syrians that we've spoken with have pretty much told us that they believe that Bashar al-Assad is going to remain in power and will probably use the deconfliction and the ceasefires to consolidate his power over time.
And it was the Kremlin that initially put this statement out after the two leaders came to an agreement on it. It took the White House some time to put its seal of approval on it. Any significance to the fact that they didn't come out immediately?
Well, that was very interesting. I mean, the Kremlin released this statement well before the White House, well before Washington, D.C. released it. So there's some confusion amongst international analysts and the media on whether this statement was truly a joint statement and why it was not released by Moscow and by Washington at the same time. So that was certainly very interesting, and perhaps was indicative of the fact that Moscow is leading the effort. For the Americans, they have made it very clear President Trump wants to defeat Daesh, and that is the extent of U.S. policy in Syria. And beyond that, there really isn't a long-term plan by the Americans, by Washington, D.C., to usher through a political process. The Russians have much more capital on the ground. They have much more military forces on the ground, much more military assets than the Americans on the ground. So that gives them a significant amount more leverage.
Oubai Shahbandar, thank you for spending the time with us.
Thank you.